I'd like to, I guess, do web stuff. And then from web, it was like, well, do you want to do front end or back end? And I was like, well, I kind of like eventually figured out that I like back end side. And then the question is like, well, what kind of back end? Do you want to do like server stuff for databases? That path kind of led me specifically, I guess, towards cloud. But what got me into open source was coming out of college. I ended up applying to a job at Red Hat, and I honestly at the time didn't even. I thought that I wasn't smart enough to work at Red Hat. I would just walk past those booths at the career fairs and think like, oh yeah, those guys are like way too hardcore and intense for me. But they're actually very friendly, nice people, and it's a great place to work. So I had applied at Red Hat. I had heard about OpenShift, and I knew a little bit about what it was from like a past internship that I had, but I still wasn't super specifically drawn to the open source side. I thought it would be cool to work in open source. I actually at the same time had an offer from Cisco, so I like picking between the two companies. I basically told the Red Hat recruiter like, hey, I think that Red Hat is a much cooler company. Cisco is definitely a great company to work for too, but could you at least like kind of match what Cisco's offering? And he was straight up with me, said, yeah, we can match it, but if you're going to take this back to Cisco, they're always going to be able to beat it. So I was like, well, that's kind of a handshake agreement. Sure, if you can match that offer, then that's good enough for me. So I started working on OpenShift, actually specifically OpenShift Online, which is I'm not sure if they still have it, but it was like a managed offering of OpenShift, so it's kind of similar to like a GKE or EKS if you're gonna draw a comparison. But it was, you could pay, have the hosting, they'd have the OpenShift cluster running for you. And on the online team, what I was really doing was a lot of the like billing and profile management service, which was a big Rails app. And I was not a Rails developer. I didn't really enjoy it a lot. And a lot of the stuff on that team specifically was closed source, and we worked on GitHub, but it was because it was profile billing management. A lot of the code, we didn't open source that. It was kind of an app that would just run on its own. So I kind of over time, after about a year or two on that team, I started to think that I'd like to work more on the actual open source side, on the really what I wanted to do was work more on the product, on like Kubernetes and OpenShift itself. But the problem was that I didn't have any experience working on Kubernetes or OpenShift. And so this was really the first time in my career that I started to leverage what open source offers for like a career path. Because the great thing about it is that it's just out there. You can start working on it. No one can stop you. I mean, if you're working for a company, they can have, there can be restrictions on projects that you can contribute to, license rules and stuff. But in the end, it's open. You can find it, learn about it, and you can build up that experience on your own time. So that's basically what I did. Was I started just kind of on my own for a couple months, working with someone at Red Hat who was working on OpenShift and Kubernetes already, and just kind of picking up some issues from them, and also just going to GitHub/Kubernetes and open up the issues tab, and I would see if there was anything that was open and that was interesting to me, and that I felt like I could solve. But there was still one of the biggest barriers, I think, to getting into open source is being afraid to just kind of being afraid and nervous to step into this like community that looks like it's moving so fast. There's thousands of developers and issues happening in Kubernetes that you don't know who's working on what. So a way that I kind of got around that and just got myself comfortable was if I found an issue that I wanted to work on, I would just work on the solution on my own time. And if by the time I had some working solution, if no one else had commented on the issue already, I would open mine then. And if someone had, then I could just compare, was I right or not, or was I close to what they ended up opening. So that was kind of a nice way for me to get a little bit more involved in the community, and eventually I would be the only person working on projects, and I started to get the confidence to just take drop a comment in myself and say, hey, I'd like to work on this. And that's when I started to learn that really all open source, any communities that are, I guess, worth working in are very open to anyone that if you're going to open up a comment, or you think that you'd like to propose a solution, or you'd like to help out. And now I can also say as a maintainer too that it is really a compliment whenever anyone comes in and offers to help work on this project. It shows that the project is growing. So that would be a big piece of advice that I would give, is never be like nervous or afraid to just open up an issue. I mean, that's what the issue button is there for. The worst thing that people can do is say, this has been asked already, here you go, and they get to close it. Or they'll say that's a good question, or this is a good proposal, or you'll get some feedback. If anyone wasn't polite and helpful about that, I would think that maybe that project isn't really that fun to work on anyway. So you really have nothing to lose. But yeah, so working on Kubernetes that way was kind of my first experience getting into open source, and that was when I really saw that, like, wow, this stuff can really help my career. It can be something that I can build a career off of because it's open and it's out there. So I worked on the Kubernetes team, one of the Kubernetes-based teams at OpenShift for about another 4 or 5 years after that. And in that time, I met a whole bunch of other people that were not working at Red Hat. And so the whole time that you're working in open source, you're pretty much networking, and you're building a big public resume that all your GitHub contributions show, exactly what this person is doing. People don't just have to take your word for it. Recruiters don't just have to, believe you that you've worked on these cool projects. You can pull up code, and especially on like big open source projects, there have been times in interviews where I tell people, like, you're already running my code. I'm just asking you to pay for me to do it now. Like if you're using Kubernetes, like thousands of people have contributed code to it, but I'm one of those people, and you're running some of my code already. So that also was a huge advantage when I ended up looking at jobs and interviewing for Google and other companies that I was interviewing at that time. Was I built up a lot of confidence in myself because I had these long running projects. I had built up a maintainership in the communities, so I had some validation that the work that I was doing was important to people, and that just made it that much easier to answer interview questions about like projects and leadership that I'd done. And at that point, you do still have to do some leak code questions, like whiteboard questions, but when you don't have to worry about those kind of soft interview questions as much, you can focus more on getting the algorithm stuff right, and that just kind of made the whole interview process a lot easier. But yeah, it was really that whole networking and that open source side of things that I think was a huge contributing factor to getting a job at Google. The team that I ended up on was actually a sort of different open source project that I had heard about while I was working on Kubernetes. It was called OpenTelemetry, which does observability and tracing and metrics for cloud native apps. So because I had already heard of that, it was a pretty good team fit. It was kind of the way that Google's interview process goes is you kind of just get sort of randomly, not randomly, but you interview, and then you end up teams that find your sort of application can post to interview you, and you do, it's called team matching. So it was kind of luck that I ended up on matched up with that project team, the project that I had already heard of. But it definitely made that sort of conversation a lot easier because I'd heard about it and worked, and then actually worked with some of the people on that team at Google already. So I could, right in that interview, sort of name drop, like, well, I didn't even do it intentionally. I was like, oh, look, I know this person from Google that does work on it. Like, oh yeah, he's actually on our team. So that was actually a little bit awkward when I ended up joining the team. They're like, so, how do you know him? Well, we open source. We worked for a little while. So then same thing sort of happened again. How I'm currently now, switching to a new company, a startup that, while I was at Google for the past year or two, ended up finding through the open source open telemetry project this new approach to observability using something called eBPF, which is, if you're not familiar with it, it's a Linux kernel feature that allows you to write sort of like small kernel modules that can be hot swapped, loaded at runtime, and give observability over the whole host. So found that really fascinating, and was working with this team of people while I was at Google, and then that just sort of eventually casually turned into a job offer. And I thought, well, I could do this full time. I really think that this is interesting, and I already knew I liked working with you guys because I made that relationship already. And so that's where I'm at now. I'll be wrapping up my last week here at Google, and I'm still working in open source. Looking back after, I guess it's been like 8 years of using open source as a career tool. I definitely recommend it. I think that it's such a powerful, even if you're not, like I said, philosophically or politically like into the whole open source idea, using it as a career building, resume building tool is so to your advantage, and especially for this is the cloud computing club. It's a very good industry that is so heavily leaned on open source software that I honestly think it would be kind of tough to not be somewhat involved in open source throughout. If you're looking into the cloud industry, they just go really well together. And there's so much that you can do in cloud, from networking, observability. Kubernetes itself has all of these different backends, and then SaaS products themselves. So that kind of brings us to where I am now. That's a quick bio of myself. I guess if you guys have any questions or anything else that you'd like me to dig into, I'm happy to chat.
That was a good walkthrough of your journey through open source, and I enjoy listening to it. So there's a lot of questions I could ask, but I guess we can go one by one and maybe go back to the beginnings of your journey into open source. So one thing I'd say me myself have experienced is like when you also shared is like you go first into an open source project and look at the issues, and you see like, oh wait, you don't know anything that's going on, right? You're completely new. So can you talk to us a little bit more about like how you step through like maybe the code, or like how you like reached out to members of the community, and how did the start go for you?
Yeah, exactly. There was definitely the social aspect of being afraid to get involved, and the technical side too, like what you're saying. So when I was specifically interested in Kubernetes, that's a massive code base that honestly, if I wasn't kind of tangentially related to it in my job, it would have even been tough to wrap my head around to get started. But the entry point that I found into the code was the CLI, if you're familiar with kubectl command. That was something that I thought, I could check a bug in this, or I could just put a print statement somewhere that I can see a print statement coming out, and I can know, all right, I've built this correctly, and I can do kubectl whatever command, and now I've got something running. Trying to do fix a bug in something like the API server, or something much more involved in the trenches of Kubernetes, would have been a lot tougher for me as just starting out. But you could build that local client yourself. And the other great thing is that being open source, all the code is out there. You can just step through it, you can read it, and you also have the whole commit history, so you can look at, if a line is confusing to you, the git blame. I use git blame all the time to look at why specifically was this line added. It's such a huge tool. What I would have done more of is, if I could go back and tell myself, like, reaching out to more people and not having to walk myself through like line by line and use print statements to learn everything. It was definitely a great learning tool, but I think that if I could have been a little bit more confident, I could have gotten more up to speed a lot quicker. And that's what I ended up doing a lot more throughout this as I got into newer areas, working on different things all the time. Is at this point now, when I have a question, like that's one of my first steps is I just will open an issue and ask a maintainer, go on Slack and say, hey, does anyone know how I can get started with this? And it's just so much easier to get pointed in the right direction from someone that has experience with it, that they can at least usually tell you, like, okay, here's the main function. Or if you can't find that yourself, which is always a good spot to look for, in any program, where's the main function? But more likely they'll be able to point you to like the specific code area, and you can trace back then to see, how do we get to this code point. But yeah, finding an area that is easy for you to reproduce and that you can build locally, you can figure out how to test it, and you have at least some idea of how to reproduce like the bug or the issue, is a great kind of first issue look. And a lot of projects will label their issues with like, help wanted or good first issue are two labels that happen a lot on GitHub, especially in the CNCF. So those are really great things to look for, and those are the ones that people are going to definitely be willing to answer questions if you have any.
Yeah, and the point that you brought up about like building and testing it, and some of the projects is not trivial to actually like get it compiled and build it. So
Yeah.
that'd be a great first step, right? To actually go through the steps and figure out how this thing builds. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Getting it built is honestly probably the first step if you're getting involved in any sort of project. Can I build it? Whenever I join a team or something, it's like one of the first things to do is, so how do I build the tool, whatever it is that we're running? Is it documented? If not, that's usually a good first task to do. Is when you start on a new team, sometimes processes and tools have changed and documentation has changed so much where the documentation hasn't been updated. And so you're kind of a good guinea pig to run through, like, okay, this is the latest edition of the docs. How do I get it started? How can I bring it up to date? What kind of friction do I run into trying to follow this? And then that's a great benefit to the rest of the team, other teams that you work with. But yeah, just getting it built is honestly the first step.
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, in open source, there's a lot of different companies involved, right? There's corporate interests as well, because they use the software and in their servers, whatnot, whatever they're using it for. Is that a big problem when like two different companies like want features and like they're not compatible? Like, how big of a problem is that in open source?
Yeah, there can be, conflicts of interest. A lot of, at least the two big projects that I've been part of, OpenTelemetry and Kubernetes, usually try to have some sort of company diversity intentionally built into the maintainership, where you don't want just one company being able to drive an entire SIG or a subcomponent for specifically pretty much that reason. But it also creates, multiple points of failure in case one company shifts their priorities. We don't have this entire component that's now lost. But ultimately, that's kind of like a social aspect of working in open source, is being able to negotiate, okay, what's actually the best for the project. And the great thing about it being open source is that, and Red Hat does this a lot too, or at least while I was there, if we can't get a feature or a change that we want in the main open source library, you maintain a fork and you can always carry a patch that has your feature. And so one of the big tasks, I had to do this one time, is that the OpenShift itself is a big fork of Kubernetes. They maintain an Excel sheet list of all the carry patches that are applied manually one by one each release into OpenShift.
It's like backporting.
Yeah, kind of like backporting, but it's every time that we try to release a new version of OpenShift, you have to make sure that all those patches get applied in the same order and that there's no new conflicts that come up. and it works. Surprisingly, something like that works. It's just one way to do that. But that can ultimately be down to the company's decision to maintain a fork. I think that that's really the most effective way for any sort of company that's making money. I think it's tough to make money off open source, off purely the open source upstream. I think that you need to have some sort of a fork or version that you're building with your branding off of it, just so that you're not coupled so tightly to an open source community, which, aside from the conflict of interest, also has different timelines. Things in open source are kind of known for moving a lot slower than companies can move, and for good reason. Because of that, because you don't want to rush too quickly into something that one person has only thought through and might conflict with other use cases. So that's the way that I've generally seen resolutions like that happen, but it can also, unfortunately, it can get contentious, but usually cooler heads will prevail for the better of the project.
Yeah, and there is a big like corporate involvement in these open source projects, but how can individuals like students, individual contributors, like what kind of issues can they take on? Like how should they approach like contributing to open source? What's the mindset, I guess? It's good to have.
Yeah, the mindset, I think the best mindset is something that if you are actually interested in doing it, I will say it can be kind of clear when someone is just sometimes opening up issues or opening PRs sort of. It almost seems like for class credit, or if it's just like to fix a small typo, which fixing typos is important and good, but sometimes it can be a little bit much. Definitely, I'm not saying don't do that. I'm just saying don't let that be the only thing that you look at. And if you have some sort of personal interest, whether that's because you're doing it for a class and you're working on this project, or just because you think that this project is cool and you want to get involved in it, those are the best places to start, and that's the best spot to come from. That's also really tough to do. Like you don't always know exactly what you want. Like I said, when I was getting out of college, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. So you kind of always have to be chasing that feeling. But if you can come from there, then at that point, that genuine interest will make it so much easier to get involved and to just reach out to those maintainers and say, I really think that this is a cool project. I've seen these couple issues. I mean, every project has a ton of issues that are open all the time. So any that you can find, or just throw your hat in there and say, hey, I'd like to work on this. Do you have any pointers on how I can get started? The worst thing that they say is no, or they don't say anything, and you can just give it a shot, and they will probably appreciate any sort of contribution.
Yeah, that sounds good. I want to open it up for everybody else in the meeting to ask questions. So if anybody else have questions, they can go ahead and ask it now. Yeah.
No, I was going to ask a question.
Okay.
I just want to know if they do.
No questions? Come on, you gotta have questions. It's not often you get to speak to someone with a lot of experience like this.
Well,
Oh, Sam, let's go.
yeah, it's not as much as a question, but I don't know, it's kind of a question. What office were you at Red Hat when you were at your time at Red Hat?
I was in the Westford office.
Oh wow, I see. I'm working right now in a co-op there at Westford, and there's actually a thing happening on Monday for people that have worked at Westford. So I don't know if you got invited yet or anything, because it's like hard to like retroactively find everyone. But if they're definitely everyone that has worked there very much invited to see the last days of the Westford office.
Yeah, I did hear that they're moving to Lowell, right? And
Yes.
like Boston is going to be the main office. That's that's a kind of a bummer. Westford was such a cool office. The
Yeah, it
culture
was
there was very nice.
so nice.
Yeah, I'll reach out to some of the people that I still know there and see if I can get an invite. Maybe I'll
Nice.
swing by.
Sounds
Yeah.
good.
Thank you for letting me know about that.
No problem.
All right. Since nobody else has questions, I guess I could ask more questions. That's cool, right?
Go for it.
Yeah. So, can you tell us a little bit more about your move to your new company, the startup? Like, what do you guys do, and like, what are the goals?
Yeah, so like I talked about, what I was doing at Google was working on just general open telemetry, which is to kind of set the stage. That's a project focused on observability, trying to define like a standard for logs and metrics, and traces are the main three signals of observability that they're looking at. Sort of a vendor agnostic standard. And it's emerging really fast. It's actually the second biggest or second most active project in the CNCF behind Kubernetes itself. And that was one of the things that originally interested me in is, I could tell that this was a very big project, and it covers a ton of different languages, different use cases, and vendors are all interested in it because it's emerging as a big standard. One of the big challenges to using OpenTelemetry, and the things that people kind of push back on a lot, is that to get this standard in your application, you have to write code to add it. You have to write code that says start this trace, write these metrics. Logging is a little weird because there's a lot of logging already, but even still, you have to set all of that up in your application. So what the new company is doing, and what they ended up donating to the OpenTelemetry project, is an approach using eBPF to basically load instrumentation. It's called auto instrumentation. You load it into the kernel in a way that can observe your application, look for certain functions, common functions that are called things like HTTP dot, make requests within languages that are statically compiled and not don't have any sort of dynamic linking that you can hook into. Specifically, it started for Go. Go's the language that I've used basically since I switched out of the Rails team at Red Hat. I love Go. I think it's a lot of fun. I think it's like a good amount of low level without being too crazy. But it's not too high. I just like the syntax, and I think that's a fun, cool language. But one of those problems is that trying to inject code into it, it's statically compiled, and you can't change that really at runtime. So the next layer that you go to outside of the Go application itself is the host, and eBPF is this thing built into Linux hosts that lets you dynamically alter the runtime of the host itself. So if the application's running on host, then you can alter these hooks, and then you've got your observability. In other languages like Java, JavaScript, and Python, those have auto instrumentation patterns that not necessarily rely on eBPF, because you have things like the Java runtime where you can kind of link in dynamically to do this sort of instrumentation automatically, and then you have interpreted languages where that can be done a lot easier too. But this opened up a lot of possibilities for Go, which is a huge cloud native language, but also other statically compiled languages, Rust, C++. So that it's a really interesting, really cool topic that to me I think is kind of underappreciated right now. I think it's getting kind of overshadowed by AI hype. But I genuinely think that eBPF as a technology it has so many practical applications right now that I think it's a very valuable choice to try to get into if you're looking for a job, especially if you're really interested in kernel stuff. But I never thought that I would ever be able to be a kernel developer. But it's being able to work on the kernel without having to so it's a lot of fun. It's cool to write a little bit of C code and get that loaded in and feel like kind of a hacker or kind of a kernel developer, but still get to play with Go and learn about those internals too. So that's what the company does. They are built off of that open source library that they've donated. That's a big common theme in open source is companies will start to work on something and then sometimes you see them donate it to the open. They say we don't want to own the license for this anymore. We want to make this open source. And so that's a good way to they can leverage the power of having a lot more developers for free and a lot more companies that are invested in it and kind of get some velocity out of their project that way to help fuel their downstream or commercial product that they're offering. And so yeah, the process of kind of getting this job was it at first felt like one of the easiest interviews that I've ever had because I kind of just met the guys and they said, would you like a job? But thinking back on it, I had really been working with them for almost 2 years at that point, writing code together. So it was actually one of the longest and hardest interviews that I've ever had. So there's kind of two ways to look at that. But it's exciting. Definitely a big move to go from Google, but it's part of that message that I had of you kind of have to always be looking for something that really interests you.
Yeah. Did someone say anything in chat? No. Okay.
Did you say eBPF? Oh. Yeah. So that's it's eBPF. It stands for Extended Berkeley Packet Filter. And if you're interested in it, I would really recommend.
I recommend taking the Linux kernel development class. There's one here at the school.
Oh, that's the wrong one. I have too many books. I haven't even read half of them. I just get addicted to buying these books on Amazon. But this book, Learning eBPF, is a very good rundown. It's like 100 pages. It's on Amazon. I would recommend reading that if you're interested in it. It's a kernel technology that has actually been around for a pretty long time. I think like 20 years almost. So it was originally just meant to filter packets out of the kernel. So it's at out of the host. So it's at very low level. You could write small programs that look at a packet that's coming in and decide whether to drop it or route it or modify it. And over time, the Linux community has really evolved it and expanded it to do a lot more stuff than just look at packets. You can look into user space programs, which is what the company that I'm working on is doing. It can look anywhere between the layer of the kernel up to user space. So you've got you can set L4 networking, you can do load balancers. There's projects like Istio and Cilium that are kind of based on that idea of networking, but it really fits for the three main use cases are for networking, security, and observability at this point. So that's a really quick rundown of it. I would really recommend the book. There's a ton of exciting talks going on. I'm actually giving a talk at KubeCon on one of the issues about it. So I totally recommend digging into it a little bit. It's fun to play with. It's really fun to see these changes happen without having to restart the program or recompile a program at all. You're just hooking into it, and you can change variables and things that are happening while it's running. So it's really cool.
Yep.
I just have a question. This is more about Go stuff since I'm trying to get more into that. But do you have any good resources or just things that you did to kind of get into Go or projects you worked on, stuff like that?
Kubernetes was a really good project to learn Go. It's very intense. There were a lot of things. It was probably a little bit more over my head than I needed to. There was some backpedaling that I had to do to learn really why I was doing some of the patterns that I was, some of the code generation stuff that I just kind of accepted as like, all right, that stuff that happens, and I don't need to worry about that. But then eventually one day someone would ask me why, or I'd have a bug with it. I think that really finding a project that's written in Go and trying to use it yourself. In my case, that was Kubernetes. It could be any other project that you find, or just build something small yourself. Come up with a little hobby project to try to do, like a web server is I think a good Go project, or just a web app. That'll get you some of the basics of like handling requests, doing Go routines. Those are two of the like most common things that I'd say that I do with Go. That's kind of what it's built for.
All right, thanks.
Anybody else have any other questions? Let me check the chat once more.
Yes, I could ask a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
First, Mike, I'd like to thank you again for being able to make it today. It was great to hear you talk, and I'm sure everyone is enjoying this very much. I guess you've worked at all sorts of environments, like at Google and Red Hat, and now at a startup. How would you describe your work-life balance, and how would you what environment do you suits you best? Do you like work at larger companies or smaller companies, or what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, work-life balance, I definitely I'm a strong believer in a healthy work-life balance. Whatever that means for you. For some people, work-life balance means that they get off from their coding job and go home and write more code all night. And that's like they're enjoying it. It's not just about that you stop coding at a certain time of day. For me, I had a lot of coding projects when I was growing up. But once I had a full-time job coding, I was pretty satisfied with it by the time I would get home at night. So I'm one of those people that kind of disconnects from it until I have, unless I have some sort of little project that I'm doing, which I don't have very often anymore because I get pretty much, I'm pretty satisfied with the work that I do. It's pretty fulfilling. So you want to definitely find stuff that you're happy with and can satisfy you. As far as which environment I prefer the most, I mean, they're all kind of have their benefits. It's really cool to work at a big company. Google isn't the first. I mean, Red Hat's kind of a mid-sized, bigger company. They're a $1 billion company. They're a $40 billion company when they got bought. Google obviously is massive, and that's just kind of cool to be working at a company that like everyone's heard of. Obviously these bigger companies come with a lot of benefits and perks and like the free lunch and stuff, and just amazing people to work with. But any good company that you're going to work with is going to always have amazing, smart people. So I don't know if I have a favorite personally. I interned at a startup. And even smaller companies, just like 2 or 3 people that were just kind of little web design companies that I worked at in college, and that can be really fun and intimate too, and a lot less structure and rules, and big company stuff comes with like the big suit, corporate guidelines that you have to follow, and it can be tougher to get stuff done and just feel that connection with your team. So there's nothing saying that you have to stick with one for your whole career, and you cannot certainly bounce around like I've been doing. But yeah, as long as you're on like a good team and you're doing stuff that you enjoy, the environment is kind of just secondary to that, which is sort of why I'm not too upset about losing out on all those perks and benefits of Google, because I'm doing stuff that really interests me.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Yeah. You mentioned the free lunches at Google. I'm curious, how were they? Were the lunches good there?
They're fine. They're good. They're very healthy. They try really hard to make a good variety of food. I love it, and the staff has always been really nice and they're friendly. Yeah, there's a good variety. The Cambridge office has, I think, three cafes, and there's the barista bar too, which is cool to go and get your cortado or your cappuccino. But then those spaces are really more kind of for like socializing, because you don't just you go get your coffee. You go with a couple people to get your coffee, and then that might end up turning into, well, I don't have any meetings for like the next hour or two, and you're just kind of chatting about whatever you're working on or something that you heard about or like direction you think the team is going. And so I think that that's really more what they want those spaces to be.
Wow. And how would you say was did you commute to Cambridge or did you live around there?
Yeah, I commuted. So I live in Central Mass. I was working in the Westford office at Red Hat, and then I got the job at Google during COVID. And so I would take the commuter rail about 2 hours each way into the Cambridge office, which I eventually ended up switching to full remote at Google while they were still offering that as an option. So I kind of lucked out with that. But that in person, I'm a really firm believer in in-person work. I think that it's really great to do, especially for when you're just getting out of college. I think that I really benefited a lot from living close to an office when I was going to Red Hat and being able to go in every day and not having any problem. Red Hat also has really flexible work from home policies too, so it was never like a strong rule that you had to go in. I think it's kind of uncomfortable how companies are taking like this very strong, like we need to push people into the office rule. But I do love the face-to-face being able to work with each other. There's its downsides to people chewing and the phone's going off behind you while you're trying to focus. But working from home is a definite challenge if you don't set good boundaries for yourself. And it kind of comes back to work-life balance, because if you're working from home and you're not like disciplined about it, it can kind of just turn into living at the office, which isn't very fun, and you don't have much real interaction going on. So I would definitely, when you're looking for jobs out of college, I don't know who's a senior getting internships here. I think that having living close to an office and being able to commute is a really great way to grow in ways outside of just getting your work done.
Wow. I think we have a question in the chat here, and I think you should be able to see it if you open up the chat within this voice channel. A question from Timothy, and forgive me if I did not pronounce that correctly. The question is, are companies still big on remote work, or did the pandemic ending kill that?
Yeah, I really felt like before the pandemic, it seemed like remote work was kind of just trending slowly towards general acceptance of like everyone that was, could do it was just kind of doing it, and people were trusted enough. That might have just been bias from working at Red Hat, who I think at the time it was like 33% of the company was full-time remote. And even more than that would just be empty desks most of the time, even if they were officially not remote. So, yeah, it sounds like it's not mandatory, which is great. Yeah, that's good that they kind of trust you to do that. I think ever since the pandemic, I think that pushed a lot of people who weren't really ready or didn't really want to work remote into a situation where they suddenly had to. And for a lot of people, it can be a lot more productive, but I think it's the mix of it's kind of forced things to swing back the other way. The vibe now that I get from a lot of big companies, like Google has a pretty strict, you have to come in, I think 3 days a week is the policy, which just having a rule like that seems weird to me. Everyone is an adult working there. It's if you can get your work done, then that should be, I think, the minimum. But then there's the other side of it to where, well, if you're someone that wants to have a lot of in-person interaction, it's not totally fair to not be able to get that from your coworkers that you're trying to learn from. But I don't think that it's not a great situation either way. You've got a lot of people that want to work from home, a lot of people that don't. I think it's just key to find a company that is respectful of whatever you need to do. Working from home has huge benefits. You can go to appointments and stuff. But yeah, I do a lot of times wish that I could have lived closer to the office at Google and been able to go in a lot more.
I have a question. So you mentioned that you took the commuter rail into Boston. How was your experience with that? Do you feel that it kind of, you said it was around 2 hours? Did you think that kind of pestered your productivity sometimes or increased it? Because I'm going to be looking like I'm going to be in a situation where I'm going to have to take the commuter rail into work most of the time. So I'm just kind of curious on how that affected your workday, and I kind of went around it.
Yeah, I mean, it was tough. You have to get up really early to be able to catch the commuter rail, and it's not just about the time that, like, nominally, if the commuter rail comes at like 7:30 and it gets to your stop at like 8:45, sure, that's not 2 hours, but you have to get there early so you don't miss the commuter rail. If you do, then it's another hour onto you because it runs once an hour in the morning to get into Boston. So that, all in all, if you're budgeting enough time to not miss it, you end up adding a lot more than you expect onto there. What is kind of unfortunate is that there's like not very good Wi-Fi on the commuter rail, or even cell service at all, even when I was like trying to tether. So what I would try to do a lot is, we have a lot of design docs at Google and things to review that, even like code reviews on GitHub or whatever I could do offline if I had the page already pulled up. So kind of try to plan my commute for like, okay, I'm going to leave at 3 o'clock today so that I can get home by 5 o'clock. I'm going to be on the train for 2 hours. I'm going to be completely disconnected. I have time to read at doc that is 15 pages long that I haven't been able to get to. And there's going to be no distractions because I literally can't do anything. So you can kind of lean into the disconnectedness of the commuter rail, and you can plan your workday around it a little bit. So I definitely pretty quickly realized it wouldn't be a very good long-term solution, and that was kind of the reasoning that I got to with my manager as well. It's not really worth it to spend 4 hours a day, 2 hours each way, on the train. And that was the same thing that I kind of told the new startup that I'm going to too. Is like, you guys don't want to pay me to do this, and I don't want to spend half of my week on a train, not able to talk to anyone. I need to be able to do more work all the time. But if this is for like an internship or a shorter term thing, I think you can definitely make it work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, let's check for more questions.
1% chance it arrives on time. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating you worked on Kubernetes. That's an amazing. It's a huge project, and I actually use a little bit. I use Kubernetes for what I do, all personal projects and things like that. So that's fascinating. Yeah. I guess what do you think is future of Kubernetes and I guess cloud native technologies compared to cloud providers like AWS and Google Cloud, etc. In terms of like the services that they provide? Do you think that in the future Kubernetes may end up being, if it already is not, if it may end up being like the default go-to, like people will build their services in Kubernetes and then just basically host it on cloud providers like they do currently, like with AWS. I forget what service, but yeah. What do you think the popularity of that will be in the future? That will be. I know
Yeah,
that's a
I
pretty
think.
loaded question, but I'm trying to keep the discussion going.
No, I mean, I was a huge, I totally love Kubernetes, and I think that it really fundamentally changed the way that we really think about like deploying apps. Like the internet itself has kind of shifted with the arrival of containers, and containers on their own were great, but having an orchestration system to do this incredible stuff at scale with Kubernetes really changed the game. I think a keyword there is at scale, because Kubernetes can be, I think there's the joke of like just deploy my blog on Kubernetes, and it's a picture of like a lunchbox strapped to a flatbed truck. That's definitely true, and it can be way overkill to use. Which is why you see, some things coming up in cloud providers, like serverless use cases. I really like Cloud Run on GCP. Kind of gives me like the familiarity of Kubernetes without having to run an entire cluster myself. I think that Kubernetes has pretty well cemented itself. I think that the hype train, like that hockey stick growth around the time that I was really getting into it, was really taking off. Like 2017, 2016 area there. Kubernetes was around for a couple years at that time. It was really getting big. I think it's starting to plateau, but not in like a way that is bad, more in a way where like when you're taking off in a plane, it eventually just reaches the cruising altitude. And you kind of feel that like sinking feeling, but it's actually just the plane like not accelerating as fast anymore. One of the kind of reasons that I was so so committed to put my career around Kubernetes at the time was because I had this feeling that like Kubernetes might not be the final thing that happens in this space, but the ideas that are being built around it and that it is developing are going to persist for a long time. Container orchestration, the way that it manages APIs, the way that you have, pod, container, deployments, replica, like these framework for a cloud native app. Anything that comes after it is going to have like smells of Kubernetes in it. So even if Gates isn't the last thing that ever happens in this space and might not be the be all end all, the skills that I learned from working on it and that anyone can still pick up from working on it, I think are going to apply and be very profitable to know for a long time.
Thank you. Yes.
I remember.
Yeah.
I remember Tyler Yan was also there at the presentation. Did he come with you to Odigos as well, or?
No, he's not. He's at Splunk, and I mean that's another cool thing about open source. Is basically like, hey, I'm switching to this other company, and everyone's like, cool, congrats. We're still working together, doing the exact same stuff. I'm actually I'll be spending more time working with him now. So it's at that point, it's like, well, awesome. Now, I don't have like other tasks at Google to work on. I can just focus on this, and we've still got a couple different companies working on it, so there's no concerns about that. It's a cool shift. So he's still at Splunk, and we've got a couple different company buy-in on this, which is great to have as an open source project.
Yeah, interesting to note is that Mike Dame and Tyler Yan met for the first time at DevConf, and they've been talking.
Yeah.
I don't know for how long. How long would you guys know each other? You've been working on the project.
I mean, as long as I had been at Google, even before we were working on the eBPF project, I knew him through just the main Go SIG, the special interest group at OpenTelemetry. And so, we knew each other through that, and just like we planned this whole talk remotely, meeting every week to go through it. And then the first time that we ever in person did the talk together was like an hour before we actually gave the talk. We did one run through, and we said, "Yep, that's just like I was on the call." So it's funny how open source can bring people together like that.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun when you eventually get to meet people at conferences.
All right. So it's about 7:30.
Speaking about,
Yeah, actually, Martin, go ahead.
sorry. Okay, yeah. Well, speaking about conferences, what is the best way to find out about conferences like Kubernetes, Cloud Native, and
Yeah. So I mean,
I guess also the Red Hat conference. I was also there. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
no, I think I don't know a great way to find out about like up and coming conferences. There've kind of been word of mouth. I found out about them from other people or companies that I've worked at. Like DevConf was the big, Red Hat one. I actually never even went to a DevConf while I was at Red Hat, and so that was the first one that I went to after I was working at Google, and I was talking at it. But so it was really cool to finally get to go to one. KubeCon, Cloud Native Con, is kind of like the big Kubernetes conference, but for all things that are like cloud native. So yeah, I'm not sure how to find out about more conferences. I guess you kind of just have to keep your ear to the ground. When you're like involved in these projects and communities, you'll hear about people are giving talks. You follow people on LinkedIn and on Twitter, and you see everyone will say, "Oh, I had this talk. Well, come listen to my talk that I shared," and then you can say, "Oh, that conference looked pretty cool. I'll have to remember it next year." Yeah.
I think we have. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I think we have one more question from Timothy. How did you figure out your career path? Still trying to find what direction to take. So I'd love to hear how you found yours and any advice you might have.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about that at the start, but that's such a good question because my big point was that I really didn't know exactly what I wanted to do for a long time, even from when I first started programming and talking about like, well, I want to grow up and be a programmer. People were like, well, what do you want to? What kind of programming you want to do? Like apps or I found web, and then between web and front end, or front end and back end. Well, back end. What kind of back end? And so I guess kind of just always chasing like what interested me. And another big tip to that I wanted to mention is to not get stuck in something that didn't interest me. It's very easy to get like a golden handcuff kind of situation where you're stuck on a team and you're there for so long that you're getting promoted and you're suddenly team lead, you're working your way up, and then it's impossible to leave. And I've seen a ton of people in those positions where they don't like what they're working on, but it would be so tough to give up like all this experience that they have. You don't want to do that. You want to keep pursuing whatever kind of, for me, it's just more of a feeling of like, oh, that really interests me. I'd like to do more of that. And the great part about working in open source is that no one can stop me. Like my boss can't tell me, you're not allowed to work on that. Always check your contract with wherever you're working because they sometimes can, or at least fire you over it. But if you're good enough at it, you'll have another job lined up probably from getting involved. So it's kind of something that I've just followed along like a greedy algorithm, sort of whatever is drawing me in that attention, in that path. And throughout that, I have built up experience from working on these projects that I've learned what parts of them that I like, and I become aware of adjacent and similar projects. And so that's what I end up pursuing further and further. And if you really look at it, I went from liking web development when I was in high school and college to now I'm doing like pseudo kernel stuff. But if you follow the path piece by piece, it makes more sense, and you can say, oh, that's how I got to that point. But yeah, you just have to, I guess, just start somewhere, and as soon as something grabs your attention, chase it, and really do everything you can to work on it. Sometimes you might have to quit your job, or change teams, or hopefully don't just quit your job, but quit your job for another job that is offering you the chance to work on that. But pursue that interest and follow that.
Yeah. So it's around 7:30, so I think an hour is a great point to end it. It's been great having you. I think we should wrap it up because we could be talking about this stuff all night.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I'd love to come back sometime. We're really hoping to be able to come in person and talk to you.
Yeah.
Thursdays just don't work out for me, but this was a lot of fun.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I put a couple links in the conference room. So there's I put a link to a Cloud Native Computing Foundation. It's what the Open Telemetry project is part of, and you have a bunch of other Cloud Native projects, cool projects going on, all open source, right? It's all open source, right? Cloud Native Foundation.
Yeah, and I'll share my new company too. I hope I spelled it right.
Odigos.io. Very cool.
There you go. I was hoping it would turn into a link. But
Yeah.
not good with computers.
Is it, do you want to share any contact info, social media?
Oh yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's pretty much my main social media at this point.
Yeah.
I have an X or Twitter. I don't really post on it much, but feel free to add me on LinkedIn. It's Mike Dame. I'm connected with Rule, and so
Yeah.
it looks like
should be
people are following me already. So cool. Yeah. Any questions, you need to follow me up there. Or you can ping me in this Discord now. I guess I'll be in here. I don't check Discord a whole lot, but I'll get to it.
Sounds good. Well, it's been great having you. Wish you a good night.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thanks. You too.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
so much.
We'll keep in touch.
For sure.
All right.
Thank you.
Great. That's good.
That went well. That was
Yay.
good.